Massey is Associate Professor of Art History at UC Irvine. She's currently, though, a residential fellow at the Huntington Library in Los Angeles. This is under the auspices of a Frederick Burkhardt Fellowship from the ACLS. This is a very prestigious fellowship for recently tenured faculty who have an especially ambitious and interesting second project. So it's part of that project that will be an important and fascinating project that we'll be hearing a piece of tonight. Right, good. Okay. Professor Massey has spent most of her academic career in Southern California. She received her BA, MA, and PhD all in art history and all from UCLA. And then after a stint of teaching at Northwestern University, she moved back west to Irvine, where she's taught since 2008. One theme that's woven throughout Professor Massey's scholarship is the centrality of the human body in representational theory and practice in early modern Europe. She's also deeply interested in the relationship between seeing and knowing in the histories of art and science from this time. These interests thread through her work on images of childbirth in obstetric atlases, on wax reproductions of wombs, on the gendering of anatomical illustrations, and on a linear perspective. As you can see from that little catalog, she's the perfect speaker for me. Her first book, Picturing Space, Displacing Bodies, Anamorphosis in Early Modern Theories of Perspective, was published in 2007. Anamorphic images, as most of you know, are images that must be seen from a particular, usually eccentric vantage in order to be legible. And they highlight the disjunction in perspectival projection between embodied viewpoint and representational field, and between geometrical ideal and practical application. The mismatch between how we occupy space and how we represent it has always haunted linear perspective, as Professor Massey recounts its history and theories. And some new work related to this work on anamorphic images will be presented by Professor Massey tomorrow at 2 o'clock at 3401 Walnut. So I hope you can join us for that. She has so much work that relates to the visual studies agenda that we couldn't let her get away with just one presentation. So her current book project is Woman Inside Out, Gender, Dissection, and Representation in Early Modern Europe. It examines the depiction of sex difference in early modern illustrated anatomical and obstetrical atlases. Excuse me. These images, she argues, had a profound effect on emergent understandings of the human body and shaped the interpretation of empiricism in medicine. Tonight's presentation is from this new work, The Hand That Knows, Epistemology and Picturing in Early Modern Anatomy. Please join me in welcoming Lyle Massey.
Thank you so much, Michael. Thanks for inviting me. I'm just saying that I've never been to Penn. I've actually been to Philadelphia, but I've visited the Mutter Museum, which it makes perfect sense after you hear this why that was the case. But I'm very, very pleased to be here, and it's very nice to be invited. And I'm also will point out to you the dangers of ever saying, when somebody says, what would you like to give? Well, I could give you this or this. And the answer is both is good, which is why you're going to have more Massey than you want in 2 days. Thanks again, Mike. So this is actually not so much a part of the book project that I'm working on, but it is a kind of ancillary problem that I think I've been working around. This particular talk deals with some issues that have come up. So the talk is not about gender, which is really what the book is about, but it is in fact about some of these issues that I deal with when I'm looking at these kinds of images. I feel like this is not quite working. Can you hear me? Actually, you put it much worse. Okay. So in 1794, the Scottish surgeon John Bell repudiated his predecessor's practice of populating engraved atlases of the human body with idealized imaginary anatomical representations. He chastises anatomists of the past who promoted an artistic approach over a properly observational one, a practice that led to such miscalculations as using, quote, the celebrated torso for putting their bowels into, to explain them there, a practice which is descended from the time of Vesalius. He refers here to a series of famous 16th century images demonstrating the human viscera in Andrea Vesalius' canonical work, De Humanitas Boris Fabrica, of 1543. These are small woodcuts that show dissections of the abdomen on fragments of antique sculpture that mimic the torso del Vedere, a Hellenistic work celebrated by Renaissance artists such as Michelangelo. Then Bell goes on to castigate one of his contemporaries, Bernard Siegfried Albinus, for doing something similar. Bell says of Albinus' engravings that precisely because of their beauty, they travesty what the anatomist actually sees in dissection. An Albinus engraving is not, quote, a true drawing of muscles dashed with touches of glands and fat and cellular substance, nor mixed with the branchings of arteries or nerves, the chief objects for which we study the muscles. But it is like a statue anatomized, where all the irregularities of substance are rounded down with a studied smoothness. It is a figure which the student can never compare with the body as it lies before him for dissection. It is a figure suiting more the eye of the painter than the eye of the anatomist. In short, Bell eschews the rhetorical visual tradition of the previous 2 centuries that treated anatomical representation as a beautiful ideal, as a statue anatomized. And he rightly notes that this rhetorical visual tradition begins with Vesalius, the Belgian-born, Paris-educated professor of anatomy who taught in the universities of Bologna and Padua in the 16th century in Italy. There's no question that the visual conventions of early modern anatomy are inextricably linked to Vesalius' epic printed atlas of the human body, the Fabrica. The Fabrica not only established the methods and rationale of the new modern anatomical practice, it also framed this new science in terms of what would become a highly influential visual language. One of the most repeated truisms of Vesalius is that he broke with the medieval academic tradition by engaging in hands-on dissection. Medieval anatomy relied heavily on the writings of Galen, the 2nd century Christian era Hellenistic physician, whose authority by the 16th century was considered unrivaled. Dissection was often understood up through the early Renaissance to be necessary only insofar as it was used to demonstrate passively what Galen had already written. As a procedure, dissection conventionally depended on a division between lower-class barbers who did the cutting and upper-class professors who did the reading and interpretation. While he was by no means the first to challenge this tradition in practice, in fact, there were academic predecessors to Vesalius who clearly engaged in hands-on dissection themselves in Italy, perhaps as far back as the 13th century. Vesalius, nevertheless, was the first to publicly insist in print that knowledge of the body could not reasonably be obtained through textual authority alone, and that Galen might have gotten a few things wrong because he didn't have sufficient experience with human dissection. Decrying the dissolution into which medicine had fallen since the Greeks, Vesalius attributed its demise to the division of labor between barbers and physicians. In his preface, he says, quote, when the whole conduct of manual operations was entrusted to barbers, not only did doctors lose the true knowledge of the viscera, but the practice of dissection soon died out, doubtless for the reason that the doctors did not operate, while those to whom the manual skill was resigned were too ignorant to read the writings of the teachers of anatomy. Now, the weight that Vesalius gave to direct experience of dissection is most evident in the famous frontispiece that you see here of the Fabrica, in which he is depicted standing over an open female corpse amid, and with his hand on it right here, amid a throng of observers. And in another plate in the book, which is the author portrait, in which he's shown dissecting the hand and the arm of a cadaver. Throughout the text, he refers repeatedly to the practical necessity of engaged practice, tells stories of his and his students' machinations in trying to obtain bodies, and at points boasts of the great number of corpses that he personally examined. Thus, the theme of learning from the manual exercise of dissection is constant and consistent throughout the book. Vesalius also weighs in on the role of engravings, of which there are over 300 in the Fabrica. The engravings are not meant to substitute for the actual dissection, but instead, he says, they're useful as aids to the student's memory and for assistance in observation. According to Vesalius, well-made images can put things before the eyes more lucidly than even the clearest language, and thus he recommends that students not only compare the text, but also the engravings to the dissected cadaver. But comparing the images to what is seen in dissection would have been really difficult for many reasons. The bulk of the atlas's engravings do not in any way refer to the actual labor of dissection, with its possibilities of misrecognition, confusing contingencies, and confrontation with variety. The book's most celebrated images serve instead as templates or schema of human anatomy that extract the universal from the particular. Vesalius's famous muscle men, which you see the first in the series right here, they emphasize a Renaissance classicized view of human anatomy filtered through Vitruvian and polyclitic rules of proportion, symmetry, and balance. These are normative images, synthetic exempla of the body based on accumulated knowledge. That is, they fall within the parameters of what Lorraine Daston and Peter Galson have called truth to nature. Reliant on a conception of truth distinctly different from that associated with later concepts of objectivity, truth to nature required acute skills of observation, but also the submission of observed phenomena to the natural philosophers' adept application of reason. Those who operated within this empiricist paradigm were considered experts because, through the exercise of judgment, they were able to generalize from the disparate sources of the senses. The point was to arrive at universal categories through confrontation with the unique and the particular. The Fabrica's engravings are among the first and most influential of truth-to-nature images produced in early modern Europe. Because of this emphasis on the normative, the sheer variance of the bodies that Vesalius encountered in practice is rarely alluded to in the engravings. And in fact, it really only appears once in a plate showing 5 adult skulls at the beginning of a chapter on craniology. One of the skulls right here, you see here, is actually missing a tooth, which makes it seem as though it really is a skull taken from life, right? That actually has individual features to it. And in addition to that, the 5 specimens of the skulls are remarkably different in their shapes and their sizes and the arrangement and pattern and number of sutures. At first glance, this would seem to indicate that Vesalius is showcasing the irregularity that dissection itself makes evident. And it is true that in the chapter, Vesalius evinces this very strong interest in variation or in variability. However, it's also in this chapter that he reveals his commitment to Renaissance conceptions of the order of nature. Rather than comparing variance across the spectrum of normal human anatomy, which is the association we would have now with what is possible in comparing variation to what we call normative, rather than doing that, Vesalius instead identifies variance as non-natural in comparison with the ideal that could and should be expected of nature. So the divergent sutures on the skulls are treated as irregularities that break with nature's intended design, right? Break with the intended order of nature. And this may be why, weirdly, 4 of the skulls have patterns of sutures that even Vesalius' own colleagues recognize as not actually occurring in life, right? So they actually are fake. The sutures themselves are fake, which means, of course, that Vesalius himself must have known that they did not exist and that they are, in fact, included in this play. So Vesalius' views in the craniology chapter give us a purchase on sort of why he so vigorously endorsed the ideal normative image in the Fabrica. It also explains why the details of dissection, its sort of practical and technical aspects, the variety of disparate evidence that it produces, the problems of the individuated versus the universal, the difficulties of seeing through the night, as it were, these aspects are largely subsumed in the representational tradition initiated in the Fabrica. The normative image, with its tropes of death-defying liveliness, of allegory and classicism, so many of the figures that are included in the life, or the full-size figures, actually penetrates through various backgrounds and landscapes, like they're fully alive. And this is a convention that's really associated with the early part of the 16th century in Italy, when anatomical atlases start to be produced. That remains this sort of paradigm for anatomical atlases from the 16th through the 18th century. And in fact, it's still very much apparent in the 18th century, when in 1747, the German anatomist Bernard Siegfried Albinus presented his atlas of the human body as the most up-to-date and painstakingly normative representation of the human muscles and skeletons so far seen in Europe. This is a little fanfare. Achieved through a meticulous method in which dissected bodies were submitted to a grid and then compared, measured, and annotated, the finished images by Jan Vandeleur are models of the universal, balanced and idealized and set, as you can see here, lifelike and living, as though living, in fanciful landscapes with ruins, animals, and foliage. The plates seem to epitomize the promise of the Sales's atlas. And yet, as we know from Bell, they were not universally praised or admired in the 18th century. Bell rejects the idea of the normative view. Instead, he embraces a different visual approach. In Bell's view, this approach is best demonstrated in Hovard Bildhu's Anatomia Humani Corporis, printed in Amsterdam in 1685, and illustrated by Flemish artist Gerard de la Ressa. The preponderance of the Anatomia's images represent the dissected body as if it were seen directly underneath the anatomist's knife. To underscore this point, the plates include pins, strings, and instruments of dissection. I'm sorry, that looks like it's kind of blurry. The resolution is high enough. Pardon? Is it okay? The question is why, after 2 centuries in which there had been this standardized salient approach to anatomical representation, it's not completely uniform, but it is dominant for sure. Why were a handful of anatomists at the end of the 18th century, the 17th century and into the 18th century, why do they revise this sort of classicized normative ideal? Why do they challenge it? What was to be gained or demonstrated epistemologically and socially by what appears to be a kind of new insistence on framing the anatomized body with the tools and the applications of dissection? While the Renaissance epistemological model, the order of nature, had certainly begun to lose its appeal in Enlightenment, this doesn't fully explain why some anatomical atlases began emphasizing a particular kind of idea of dissection. Now, Bell insists that anatomy is to be learnt only by dissection. Dissection is the first and the last business of the student. And when drawings are made for his use, the body should be laid out as he is to order it in dissection. Now, this is hardly a revolutionary position to take at the end of the 18th century. Bell obviously no longer has to argue, as Vesalius did 2 centuries earlier, that dissection is necessary to modern anatomical inquiry. Rather, what Bell seems concerned with is how to represent the practice as a conduit, as a peculiar conduit for knowledge. Bildhu's images are intended to put the viewer into the anatomy theater. Bell, once again, acknowledges that this kind of practice to representation does have its drawbacks. the disordered sort of tangle of lines that results from trying to transcribe directly what is seen on the dissecting table can lead, he says, to misunderstandings. One might not be able to ascertain the difference between types of tissues unless one is already very skilled in deciphering them during actual dissections, or more interestingly, unless one is very practiced in deciphering them and reading them in images, right? So he's actually sort of saying that it's both a skill that has to be learned in terms of dissection, but also a skill that has to be learned in terms of images. However, these disadvantages, he says, are more than compensated for if the images themselves demonstrate the epistemological connection between observation and practical experience. It is their emphasis on the idea of practice that makes Bidlu's images especially appealing. And I say idea here because Bidlu's engravings are clearly staged and could no more serve as a guide to students than those of the Salis' Fabrica. So what we're dealing with here is an ideology, not necessarily an actual practical application. For instance, one of Gerard de Lores's most inspired improvisational touches is to include a fly in an engraving of an abdominal section. And you see that it's right here in the drawing, and here it's reproduced in the engraving. Now, that actually for de Loressa, what he's doing is basically including what is a fairly standard kind of trompe-l'oeil detail that would have been common, or was common in still lifes of the period anyway. So it already has the fly has a history of its own in the history of art. But for Bell, the fly connects Bidlu's images concretely to his practice. And for the same reasons, right? It's a kind of redescription. So the fly is there in the still life, basically, to sort of show the decay of nature and to serve as a kind of memento mori. It does so here as well for Bell, but in doing so, it actually tells a different kind of story for him, one that pertains specifically to dissection. Comparing Bidlu's grittiness to Albinus's classicism, Bell states, in Albinus, we think that we understand every muscle of the human body, but our knowledge hardly bears the test of dissection. In Bidlu, we have the very subject before us, the tables, the knives, the apparatus, down even to the flies that haunt the places of dissection, so that the dead subject and the engraving can well bear to be compared. So this is how Bell basically is responding to this, and he does obviously see this as a kind of major change in approach and perspective in anatomical illustrations. It's not entirely evident what propelled Bidlu, though, to introduce these kinds of innovations. Bidlu was a Dutch surgeon and anatomist born in 1649 who studied medicine with Frederick Ruysch in Amsterdam. He spent some time in London, eventually obtaining an appointment as royal physician there in 1701. He also taught off and on in Leiden until his death in 1713. Recent scholarship suggests that his innovative approach to anatomical illustration might be connected to his disputes with his former teacher, Frederick Ruysch. A Dutch anatomist now best remembered for his anatomical specimens, Ruysch kept a cabinet in Amsterdam for displaying elaborate moralizing tableaux in which fetal skeletons were arranged in imaginary landscapes populated with rocks and trees made from preserved human tissues and organs. This is the catalog, one of the catalogs that he published with print engravings of the tableau. The tableaux are real, but then they are popularized through the engravings. Ruysch was also known for his anatomical preparations, particularly a mysterious clear liquid in which he suspended eerily well-preserved and lifelike infant heads and body parts, dressed up with glass eyes, hair, and lace collars. It's the stuff of the Mutter Museum's dreams. Bidlu disdained these fanciful setups, criticizing Ruysch's cabinet for unnecessarily decorating dead bodies with knickknacks. And he rejected Ruysch's attempts to make cadavers appear more lifelike. This may have been in part because his Mennonite beliefs led him to insist that there was something inherently illicit about trying to make the dead appear to still be alive. However, Bidlew's criticisms of Ruysch were not simply over matters of taste or religious conviction. They were also deeply epistemological. As Daniel Marcoschi has shown, Bidlew rejected Ruysch's reliance on prepared specimens for several reasons. One, they temporarily freeze parts of the body, thereby belying the constant change over time that even dissection can actually make apparent. So even the body is actually in constant state of decay during dissection, and so there's a sense that the anatomist is always sort of chasing the changes that are actually occurring on the table temporally. So it's not just in life that the body changes, but the body changes in death as well. Number two, they don't allow the student to compare different points of view. These are, again, he's talking about the preparations, the specimens, basically, they're taken from bodies and body parts. They don't allow the student to compare different points of view or to adopt diverse observational techniques. For instance, in most anatomy courses in the 18th century, microscopes and magnifying glasses were often used to give students more detailed views of the qualities and textures of membranes and tissues and follicles. As you see here, this is something that's represented in Bidlew's atlas, where in fact you see microscopic views of hair follicles and of thumbprints. And three, they often distort body parts disproportionately, which is a point illustrated by Bidlew here in his depiction of the heart, one of which is a normal heart here and one which has been injected with wax. And what you see here is the distension of the veins on the exterior of the heart, which transforms really the physical appearance of it. So it's a contrast, he says, that basically for us disguises what the real heart actually looks like when we dissect it. So Bidlew's concerns about preparations, about specimens, throw into relief one of anatomy's most pressing concerns: how to neutralize the contradiction between the living body, in which temporal processes are at work, and the cadaver, in which all fluidity and changeability has been still. Certainly by the 18th century, anatomical dissections had developed into a highly diverse and complex series of interactions and demonstrations, basically because they had to explain animate systems on an inanimate body. So they developed a whole series of strategies for being able to do that, or for sufficiently for students. For example, in his anatomy course, Alexander Monroe Primus, the Scottish physician who taught at Edinburgh in the first half of the 18th century, he describes sort of the whole sort of process, basically, of his anatomical course. He dissected the cadaver over the course of many days, injected the vascular systems with wax and then applied stain to various tissues, inflated lungs and other organs with bellows, invited students to study specimens under microscopes or with magnifying lenses, performed vivisection of animals for comparative purposes, exposed and discussed diseased parts, exhibited preserved specimens and bones for juxtaposition, and compared dissections to drawings and engravings. So you're thinking this is like a carnival of possibilities basically being enacted in the anatomy theater for visualizing the body in a multitude of ways, and learning how to interact with it even through a multitude of different kinds of points of view. Dissection was a messy, complicated affair that could reveal many difficult issues and problems of interpretation, such as just determining what one is actually seeing when one opens the body. And in fact, dissection often offered surprises every time the body was opened. Tumors in new places, oddly shaped and even duplicate organs, when people have more than one, diseased or normal tissue of unexpected color or texture. Extrapolating the living body from the dead required patience, imagination, and above all, the ability to work through the temporal restraints of the anatomical theater. This point is rhetorically staged in Bidlew's engravings, in the sense that they attempt to convey the temporality of the anatomy theater through reference to practice. Another work mentioned approvingly by Bell as one that is drawn truly and from nature is William Hunter's Anatomy of the Human Grounded Uterus, printed in Birmingham in 1774, and illustrated by primarily by a Dutch artist, Jan van Remsdijk. Educated in Glasgow and Edinburgh, Hunter arrived in London in 1741 and soon established himself as a successful surgeon and eventually a fashionable man midwife, eventually becoming physician extraordinary to Queen Charlotte. In addition to his activities as a man midwife, Hunter became a celebrated anatomist in London. There was no formal school of medicine in London in the mid-18th century. Public demonstrations of anatomy were offered by the Company of Barbaric Surgeons, which had a legal right to dissect 4 bodies of criminals every year. But these events were limited in scope. Hunter set out basically to fill the gap with his own conception of a structured and rigorous anatomy course, advertising that he would provide instruction in the same manner as Paris, and he'd actually gone to Paris and taken courses there. Hunter's atlas and its startling images, of which you see one of them here, which is probably the most famous image from the atlas, are thus products of his combined practice as a man midwife and anatomist. In the plates, the female pelvis is detached from other recognizable parts of the body. The legs, arms, and part of the torso have been cut and removed. The plates visually emphasize the marks of cutting and slashing, the ragged, fibrous tissues and layers of fat, the indeterminate nature of the relationship between tendon and muscle, between cavities and organs. Writing about this, one of his own most celebrated images, this one, Hunter insists that it was taken directly from the dissection of a woman in her 9th month of pregnancy. Nothing, he states, has been altered from the original situation, not even the crook of the fetus's finger right here, which, he insists, was not added to make the image more appealing, which is like, would be hysterical if it weren't so tragic to read that, but in fact, the idea that it makes it more fetching, and then he's insisting that he hasn't done anything to make it more fetching. As with Bidlew's atlas, Hunter's engravings are intended to convey visually a "you are there" quality. Along similar lines, in table 26 of the human grounded uterus, a window here is reflected on the transparent membrane, the chorion, covering a 9-month-old fetus. Again, these are techniques that are very familiar to those of us who've seen still life from the 17th through the 18th century. This is actually a common kind of motif. But here it gets sort of retranslated into trying to account for the temporality of the anatomy theater, referring to both the spatial and the temporal setting of the dissection. Now, it might be tempting here to begin to attribute to Hunter's engravings the quality of objectivity, the 19th century value ascribed to intentionally unmediated images, because Hunter himself is actually saying, this is, we are showing it exactly as we saw it, right? And so it's as though he's trying to create the impression from what he says about the images that they are unmediated representations of what is actually seen. But as Dassin and Galson point out, this would actually be a mistake. Bidlew's and Hunter's images are highly manipulated. Bidlew's plates, you see 2 of them here, may emphasize gritty graphic details, but while the representation may diverge from the Thessalian view, it nevertheless presents a highly refined aesthetic. For instance, in Bidlew's table 71, while each tendon of the hand is picked out carefully with pins, each is also carefully laid out across a book that symbolically alludes to the anatomist's learning. In addition, the skeletal forefinger here is opposed to the thumb, which is resting on a pin right there, and is delicately and elegantly extended basically forward, resting on this tiny little semicircular extension to a kind of plinth underneath. It's as if It is providing a literal index to what is being demonstrated, pointing to the viewer. The whole arrangement speaks of careful display. While on one hand, the image putatively demonstrates the specific details of dissection, in the pins and the instruments, on the other, it allegorically equates the body to the book of nature and invites the viewer to contemplate the mysteries of this equation, requiring that the viewer obey the dictum so often attached to anatomical works of period, actually from Vesalius, even before, even from Vesalius on. The finger is laid out as a form of interpolation. The viewer is instructed to know thyself, which so is the dictum that is attached to anatomy starting at the beginning of the 16th century from the Greek epigram, the Delphi. In another of Bidlu's images, the one on the right, an analogous contrast emerges in the dissection of a female cadaver. On the one hand, her back is laid out, the muscles fanned and draped, the skin flayed, and the wrists are tied with string behind her, as though, in fact, she is a specimen on the dissection table. On the other, her arms appear clean, plump, and relaxed, and her delicate, manicured hands are offered to the viewer as if in supplication, a sign of the viewer's presumed control over the knowledge that she proffers. Well, that's so interesting. I'll go back. Similarly, Hunter, I don't know how that just disappeared. That's so odd. That must be some freakish thing in your system because it was there. Pardon?
Let's go back to the one you showed before. It's the same slide.
It's not the same slide. It's actually a different one, but it's okay. I think you'll get it. I'll go back to it in a second. That Hunter, in spite of his protestations to the contrary, could not claim that his images constituted unmediated representations. You have those brutal cuts on the thighs and the meticulously detailed rendered of dissected fat, tissue, and skin that seem like these sort of visceral indices to the anatomy theater. But it's also clear that Hunter used injections of colored wax and mineral oils. It used mineral oils and injected wax basically into the veins and vessels in order to keep it plump for Jan van Rundstedt to actually reproduce these sort of drawings for, and also because he was the bodies were in the constant process of being preserved as specimens as well. So he's not. They have to often be done pretty quickly, but they can't be done quickly enough for him not to also be trying to preserve them as they go. So in fact, these are really false in the sense that they show us something that is not, doesn't actually work as the kind of unmediated image that Hunter wants us to think it actually is. So throughout his dissections of cadavers, Hunter was concerned with producing these specimens, and then so the corpses were in this constant state of conversion into a preserved state. Thus, neither of these two authors could be accused of choosing a more realistic or objective approach to the subjects at hand. Rather, what they want to do is communicate a certain idea about dissection, conveyed through an aesthetic that evokes the notion of inert matter, the cutting hand, and the stench even of the anatomy theater. Now, like Bidlu, Hunter believed that there was no real substitute for experience obtained through dissection alone. He did endorse the idea that images were necessary for conveying knowledge, but he also expressed a very strong preference for what constituted the acceptable quality and point of view of those images. In his preface, Hunter distinguishes between two traditions in anatomical illustration. One, the first, is a simple portrait in which the object is represented exactly as it is seen. The other is a representation of the object under such circumstances as were not actually seen but were conceived in the imagination. Although he sees value in both approaches and touts the beauty and strength of Vesalius' images, Hunter's epistemological investment is in the first, the object represented exactly as it is seen during the procedure of investigation. And he, not surprisingly, associates that specifically with Bidlu, who Atlas had appeared perhaps why the anatomy of the human rounded uterus relies so heavily on the visual trope of cutting. The engravings rhetorically magnify the connection between fully understanding pregnancy and the sort of delicate sectioning and probing and unveiling enacted by the surgeon's knife. Hunter's engravings present scientific vision as an affect of practice. They indicate that the eye is insufficient by itself to convey the reality of the subject under study. Given the scarcity of pregnant female corpses, Hunter was staking his reputation on being able to incontrovertibly prove that he had direct experience with rounded uteruses. The particularity and individuality of the cadavers mattered because it connected Hunter, the active man midwife, and Hunter, the practicing anatomist. The normative image would have been insufficient to prove how and what the anatomist knew about pregnancy, a process that, in order to be understood, had to be accessed through this sort of act of cross-pollination. Dissection, which allows you to recognize what's occurring internally, and practice as a midwife, right, which is diagnosing and treating the external signs of what's actually happening inside. Unlike Vesalius, for whom dissection provided a method for understanding the body as a microcosm of nature, for Hunter, dissection was a perceptual modality that allowed constant manual interrogatory engagement with the body. Both Hunter and Bidloo give visual form to an old analogy between sight and the knife, one that dates back to the 17th century. Using the expression, and I'm sorry, Larry, because I'm going to murder this Dutch phrase, but the de scherpte des Ogs te wetten, the don't comment, I don't want to hear how bad it was. That's a phrase that could equally apply to honing a knife. Dutch artist using that phrase, Samuel van Hoogstraten, suggested that observation of nature could feed or sharpen the eye. The analogy between vision and the knife in anatomy trades on similar ideas. It's visually demonstrated in one of the most famous paintings of the 17th century, Rembrandt's Anatomy Lesson of Dr. Tull, or the most famous painting that deals with this particular subject matter. Modeled on Vesalius's author portrait, Rembrandt's painting focuses on Tulp's right hand, with which he demonstrates the flexor digitorum superficialis, lifting it from the flexor profundus underneath to show how the muscles move the fingers into flex, while simultaneously flexing the fingers of his left hand as a living analog to the demonstration he's making with his right. The painting apotheosizes the surgeon's hand as that which is self-dissecting and self-knowing. William Schupbach makes the case that the painting draws an analogy between the hand of God and the hand of the anatomist, in the sense that both produce knowledge. The knife, or in Tulp's case it's actually forceps, becomes a shorthand emblem for seeing the body from the inside out, of sharpening vision by filtering it through manual contact. Bidloo's and Hunter's engravings trade on this idea by establishing surgery's privileged relation to anatomical knowledge. By the late 18th century, surgery in England had metamorphosed from a choice of last resort to a more highly regarded practical form of medicine that empirically connected treatment to anatomical investigation. Historically equated with barbers, surgeons in England succeeded in breaking away from the company of barbers and surgeons in 1745 to form their own company and claim a special status for surgery. In part, they did this by using their skills at cutting, as did Hunter, to perform anatomies. It really becomes fairly common for surgeons to start holding anatomical courses. Like anatomy, surgery required by its very nature a manual, probing, and skilled manipulation of the body by both hands and tools. Increasingly, this was seen not as surgery's drawback, but as its virtue. And this has something to do with the whole sort of hierarchy of apothecaries, surgeons, and physicians in England. And in fact, Hunter was a vociferous social climber, Scotsman who was bound and determined to move his way up the social ladder. And he continued to, he had sort of joined the company of surgeons, but continued to try and gain entrance to the Royal College of Physicians in England, which actually was the body, the body that kind of was accorded the most status for medicine in England. And in fact, he was finally admitted when he was quite a bit older. He was finally admitted, but was unable to secure a fellowship when he was in the college, and that was because of his practice as a man and midwife. So he was sort of undercut by what was seen as the kind of lower form of medicine and practice, which is man midwifery. It was, in fact, though, through dissection and anatomical manipulation of the body that Hunter made his most important discoveries about human pregnancy. Although his priority on the matter was disputed, Hunter claimed to have discovered the critical fact that fetal and maternal blood circulatory systems do not intermingle. The discovery was likely actually made by his younger and eventually more famous brother, the surgeon John Hunter, who observed the separation between the two systems in a pregnant cadaver, the placenta of which had been exceptionally well injected during dissection. The discovery resulted from the technical, therefore, from the technical and manual skills applied by those who were, at the time, Hunter's assistants. It might be fair then to say about 18th century anatomy in England that at times it was constituted through what Pamela H. Smith has called artisanal epistemology. Like the skilled work and their experimentalism endemic to the mechanical arts and alchemy, which Smith claims was appropriated and reformulated into the model of active empiricism embraced by Enlightenment thinkers such as Francis Bacon, the surgeon's skill with the knife provided a similar foundation for the reform of medicine. This understanding of empirical practice, the idea that knowledge results not from passive reception of sense impressions, but from an active sense-based probing of nature, recasts anatomical vision as a process of interrogation dependent on manual engagement. In this sense, then, Bidlew's and Hunter's atlases present an important variation on truth in nature. While the view through the knife points to the authority and skill of the anatomist, it also speaks to the idea that knowledge of the body is located in the activity of dissection. So one might say that in Bidlew and Hunter, what we are given is the idea of truth to method. Right? That this is the method that actually makes knowledge possible. The naturalism of the images is meant to serve less as evidence of their direct connection to nature than as evidence of the active empiricism employed by the authors. Rather than simply being repositories of images of record for the observational sciences, Bidlew's and Hunter's atlases are indices to the method by which anatomical knowledge might be obtained. This is not to say that Hunter in particular did not see his atlas engravings as permanent records of the broad uterus that would serve the interests of collective empiricism, because surely it did. However, the images also function epistemically, in the sense that they outline a way of looking, a way of working, and an implicit belief in the empirical power of skilled manipulation. In short, in Bidlew and Hunter, the relationship between vision, knowledge, and representation undergoes a shift. Anatomical vision is viewed no longer as a kind of passive and mirroring sense, but as an active probing one that's indelibly tied to touch. Thank you.
Sometimes you do something that's perfectly blanks.
Is that what I
And
did?
they know I've done it.
It's gone. Yeah, I think
It's
it's not. It's actually gone off my computer. So maybe I just hit delete. It's not even in my. Yeah, it's just
Was
gone.
this the same Hunter that you showed earlier?
No, it was a different Hunter. It was actually a different Hunter image of the body from the side. It doesn't matter, right? The argument still stands. Larry?
I wanted to reinforce your point, no pun intended, by in fact talking about the medium of engraving, because in fact the tool of the engraver is itself a probing instrument which takes something that is otherwise undisturbed and cuts into it. And that's essential. In fact, what you call engravings in Vesuvius are in fact woodcuts.
Yeah.
So the shift, in fact, from the broader and more orderly structure of woodcut to engraving is precisely a choice that is made by these later, I mean, for various reasons, detail being one of them, by these various later illustrators. Which leads me to another question about something that you didn't show that is itself already a difference, and on some level has losses and on some level has gains, and that's the contemporary French works of the 18th century, which introduced color, particularly the color of muscles, to the representation of a very similar kind of anatomy to the woman from behind, from Bidlow, that you showed.
You mean like the Aquadita Gautier, the mezzotint, yeah.
Exactly.
I mean, those are interesting because they don't have anything like, because mezzotint is such a blurry, essentially blurry kind of medium. It introduces color, and what you gain in color, you lose in detail. So they really are, in fact, they're often, and Genti, there are several of these sort of depictions of the pregnant, of the gravid uterus that are often lumped together, but in fact, as you point out, the median really does have an effect.
Does Bell comment on those or not?
No, actually, he doesn't, because he's really, I don't think he would actually, his commitment really is to, and so is Hunter's to engraving, which is interesting that you brought that up, because actually there's a good sense, and good evidence really that for somebody like Hunter, that he specifically embraces engraving as the only medium that can actually do justice to the complexity of anatomy and communicate really the way in which dissection actually teases out the kind of detail of the body.
The other small thing, but for me, what was very instructive about the Bidlow images is that Laressa, who is largely known as a painter, not as a designer of engraving, is much closer in his paintings to the heritage of the Renaissance and to both subjects and depictions that would be deemed loosely classicistic. And for him to have designed those really quite fastidious drawings for the engraving, I'm not sure who the engraver was, I'm sure it wasn't Laressa himself. But there's an irony there, and it also points out what is another failure of our discipline, that we don't look enough at books, and that for years and years, until recent exhibitions like Ackerman's, we didn't take what was dismissed as scientific illustration as part of visual culture, and we must and should, and I think.
Oh yeah, well, I'm just like a little PE brain, off on the side. There are many people who have done this, and probably much better than I have. I mean, I think it's become a field in and of itself at this point. And I find myself being very careful to talk about the image and not the illustration and things like that, because we really are dealing with a kind of set of conventions and traditions that are that constitute in and of themselves a discourse on what it means to make an image. So, but I do think that the issue of engraving is such an interesting one, because I do think that because the other sort of great imagistic tradition that emerges in the 18th century are waxes, anatomical waxes, and so those have an indexical relationship to the body that's actually quite unique, because they're the ones that are produced at La Specola are produced from casts, from literal casts of bodies and body parts, and so they have they can make a certain kind of claim to realism that the
Which also brings up the issue relative to portraiture, the death mask and the wax portrait, which was also not an 18th century phenomenon per se, but flourished.
Yeah. Yeah, there's a death mask of William Hunter. Glasgow, yeah.
So I wanted to, first of all, it was a fantastic talk, thank you. I wanted to perhaps add to your point by suggesting that it was particularly important to John Bell to distinguish himself as the only professor of anatomy in Edinburgh who was teaching anatomy in relation to surgery. So he was talking particularly about the Monroes, who had a long tradition of anatomical training, but weren't practicing surgeons. And in fact, although we see those two as married, they weren't actually married in training always. So for Bell, it was really important to emphasize the point that he was a practicing surgeon and that he taught anatomy in relation to surgery, again, emphasizing the active part of knowing. And I would say that that holds true for Hunter as a practitioner as well, and maybe not so much for some of the other, the earlier anatomists who had posts as anatomists and maybe didn't rely to the same degree on practice to validate their expertise and their forms of knowledge. So,
yeah, no, I think you're absolutely right. And I think that this, I mean, it's no accident I end up dealing with English atlases, right? You start with Bidlu has this sort of like honorary position, especially because of the piracy issue, where his atlas is actually published, plagiarized, basically, in London. So he has this sort of honorary position, but he is, in fact, in the model of Frederick Reusch, actually appointed anatomist at Leiden. So you're absolutely right about that. So it does seem like, I think that must be the case, that we're really talking about a very specific social milieu within which, particularly with the Scots, right? That the Scots have this very antagonistic sort of position in London. There's the whole, Hunter leads this sort of, or is one of the physicians that kind of leads this insurrection in the College of Physicians, right? And so much of that seems to have to do with the sort of what kind of skills he could lay claim to. And I think and that's such an interesting point about John Bell, because I think the same thing must be true of John Hunter as well, who is really a surgeon. It's like the first one to perform a cesarean section successfully and that kind of stuff. So he really does represent himself as a surgeon, but of course is publishing on anatomy and performing anatomies all the time. So I think that's a really great point. And I do think that does also bring us back to how localized this particular, historically specific, this particular set of images, or atlases actually is an experience. That's a great point. I'd love to talk more about that. Yeah.
Thank you. I think my question is quite related, and it's asking a little bit more broadly what the place of the social, religious, political is in your epistemology. I was interested in the moment when Bidlu turned out as a Mennonite, but you didn't make that much of it, and I wanted to know whether that's a strategic choice and how that came about, because obviously naturalism, realism are so embroiled in Reformation, Counter-Reformation rhetorics, as you know. So I'm just wondering whether the epistemological, in your sense, isn't just a little bit too narrowly defined as scientific knowledge that can, in some sense, shield itself off from the pressures of the social. But I'm sure you'll want to insist on who wants reading and what I'm reading.
Yeah, and I think you're absolutely right. I mean, I think one of the problems when you deal with a set of images that are made sort of in response to one another, right? We think Hunter is literally, Hunter celebrates Bidlu, as does Bell, as one of these sort of predecessors on whom he himself is relying as somebody who broke ground and headed in a new direction. So you end up sort of dealing with that as a kind of discourse, which is really what it is. Right? This is a set of people who are sharing a certain, set of issues, right? And they are thinking about them the same, or thinking about them as problems that they are dealing with in similar ways. And that does end up bracketing out certain kinds of other sort of concerns. I think that's really interesting. The argument about his Mennonite beliefs is Rena Knopf has actually written on that. And this is where I start getting into territory I don't really know or understand that well. Because Daniel Marcosi, who's really, he is the prime person who writes on Bidlu now. His dissertation, his book, everything. I mean, he's been publishing on Bidlu, and he doesn't think that that's actually. I see you nodding, but he does not actually really think that has the kind of power that she would like to give it in his response. Now, I will freely admit I have not read Bidlu from cover to cover, and so this is not something that I think I'm really equipped to evaluate. I think in my, so I don't really know, although I didn't bring any of them in, although this is a good example, right, of his sort of, it's not just that he doesn't want to show bodies alive, it's that he, he doesn't want to include in his images sort of tropes of likeness, but that he exacerbates the, I mean, if you look at an image like this, he exacerbates the horror of death. And I think that he does that intentionally. So that, I don't really know how that would dovetail with sort of this idea that, in fact, it goes against some kind of religious prescription to, you know, show the dead body in any way that it actually might appear to be
Or the
alive.
whole body.
Pardon?
Or the whole body, which might be an issue for them. They're very anti-image. So the idea that he's showing microscopic images and details rather than integral bodies may be significant.
There are plenty of full length though in the Biblion. I mean, and also there are skeletons that are, in fact, one of the skeletons is holding, I believe, an hourglass is actually quite alive-like. So I mean that, right? I mean, in other words, it's that lifelike trope that you see in Destabilizing. So it doesn't, that doesn't hold either. Yeah. Yeah. Sorry.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
Sorry, I was
Yeah,
just going to
okay.
say, I think on this point, particularly in the British context, this is absolutely the sort of thing you're talking about in terms of people playing off their contemporaries and off, you know, fellow artists. So, you know, there's a dispute between Joshua Reynolds and William Hunter, for example, over whether artists or anatomists should be the ones who set the aesthetic for anatomical illustrations. And for the anatomist to win that, he has to say, you know, no, look, these bodies need to be depicted as dead bodies, because if what you want is, you know, rounded, living, lifelike bodies, then, you know, the artists win. They get to take control over that epistemology, right? So I think there, you know, the Mennonite thing, I think, you know, is an interesting part of it, but it seems to me that there's another context, another sort of social and intellectual context, which has to do with communities of artists who are, in some senses, potentially controlling the images of anatomists that show their epistemologies, right? So,
Yeah, and I think, I mean, I actually think that you'll notice that, I mean, you start, as you work on these, it's true you know this too, right? You start to feel like you are in this quandary because the books themselves are attributed to the anatomists. But in fact, all the ones that I mean, starting with Jan Stefan von Holocaust and Vesalius, about whom very little is known. I mean, the relationship between them is very murky if it existed. But as you get to Jan van Roemsdyk and Jan van der Leer and Albinus and Roemsdyk and Smellie and Hunter, so William Smellie is the name of another man midwife who actually publishes a very important atlas on pregnancy too. But they are working so closely with individual artists, and there is a clear sense, certainly with, and Lorenzo is a really interesting case, because that's sui generis for him. There is nothing else like that in his entire oeuvre, right? And yet it's so startlingly new, right? It's just, it does something that it hasn't been seen in that tradition. So it's, you know that there's some kind of working relationship we don't understand, actually, between anatomists and artists. And that is a much larger project for some graduate student here to do, which is actually really to do a very detailed study of the interaction between, as far as it can be done, between artists and anatomists. I do think that the social aspect of sort of, British obstetrics is actually important to the story also, which is that we're talking about a period in which, in the 18th century, when man midwifery is beginning to sort of eclipse midwifery as a kind, and we have these Scots basically coming from, who were trained in Edinburgh, coming to London and starting to lay claim to this as a particular kind of profession, basically, and starting to professionalize it, and using it in a lot of ways to carve a niche out for themselves in the very cutthroat world of London medicine. And so midwifery and the kind of social story around that, which is the increased control of women who are midwives and the increased sort of attempts to professionalize midwifery and increase number of men who actually become sort of obstetrical surgeons. That is a different kind of story against which the atlases also have to be seen, which is a kind of a story of control and a desire for control over certain aspects of medicine. And of course, there's the gender story as well, or the story of gender, which is that these are female bodies, and this is about pregnancy, and women who actually normally deliver babies but were in fact being usurped as well.
Thank you very much. I wanted to ask you about the 17th century and whether there's any interaction between the discussions in medicine, which fit the classical texts and idealizing Renaissance illustrated texts, and the new, more empirical observation, any relationship between that discussion and the discussions going on in the French Academy of Architecture and Literature, between ancient sources, moderns, and the ancient ideals versus what now to be true, because we can pull that thing. I don't think in particular this is the Academy of Architecture. The modern is Perrault, who is a doctor who famously, at least from architectural stories, dies because of an infection contracted while assembling a camel.
That's great.
So is Perrault's camel lurking in the background?
Right, with the rhinoceros, right?
Yeah, I'm thinking exactly what that is, exactly the thing that prompted it. The other seem very parallel debates going on in the other academies at this time.
That's just fascinating. I mean, I would love to talk with you more about that. I can't, off the top of my head, say that I know of any actual sort of connections, but I think that's a really interesting. I mean, one of the things that as I was writing this, though, I actually thought, well, the weird thing about this is the sense that I was getting as I was writing it, that it's not really a challenge. It's not the moderns and the ancients so much as it is a kind of return to perhaps the spirit of Vesalius that we're seeing. And that's another way of sort of talking about this is not that, because I think there's been a temptation sometimes with Hunter's images to think of them as somehow some kind of transitional image between truth to nature and objectivity, Daston and Gallison. And, you know, they totally defy, I think, you know, I try to show, they really defy any attempts to make them into that. But I also think that that kind of return to, I mean, from Vesalius's preface, and of course Hunter owns a copy of Vesalius, and you know, there's this sort of sense that somebody like Hunter is well aware of the long tradition of anatomy into which he is an inheritor, that he's returning to that idea that's in Vesalius' preface about joining the barber back to the physician. And so he's not necessarily seeing himself as overthrowing some kind of ancien regime or something like that. In fact, if anything, it's almost as though we are seeing a kind of visual articulation of what it would mean to it sort of attest to what it is that dissection itself actually does in Vesalius.
Well, I'm just saying, Renaissance architectural text is a sort of rhetorical embrace of the kind of that's what it's just the push and shove. It's the system of divinely ordained, historically sanctioned proportions that wins out, despite the fact that the beginning said
Is that true by the end of the 17th century? That, I mean, Vitruvius is...
Well, by the end of the 17th century, Perrault translates Vitruvius into French and takes him apart. You know, this isn't true. When you go out into the field and measure ancient buildings, they don't turn out to be like Vitruvius said they are.
That's like dissection, right?
Exactly. Well, no,
like Galen, right?
I mean, it's sort of,
yeah.
I mean, Galen isn't right.
That's
the I just hear these echoes of the architectural debate going on in here. And of course, it's also sort of usefully parallel to the physicality and the three-dimensionality of
Right.
Yeah.
Oh, I love that. I mean, I love the idea of a sort of archaeology
Yeah.
Somehow being
Yeah,
some
yeah.
kind of cousin
Yeah.
to dissection.
Yes, I think it really,
Yeah.
I think it's there.
That's neat.
It would seem obvious that there are no women anatomists in the chronology that you cover, or you would have mentioned it. Do any women ever enter this competition as anatomists who publish illustrations and so on? Presumably later than the period you're dealing
Well, there's sort of strange cases. There's Anna Morandi in Bologna, the wax modeler, who becomes actually very famous in the 18th century for basically producing these. This is what I was saying about that alternative tradition. Actually, it's kind of interesting because it's actually the women that I do know, either they're continental, they're French, and they produce somewhat rudimentary, in terms of images, not in terms of text, but obstetrics manuals. The French basically institute a kind of national program for obstetrics that is run by midwives. And so, in fact, what you see is the production of texts that go along with that. But the images don't have the kind, they're not making this, they don't have the same kind of effect or aren't making the same kinds of claims as the images of these obstetric models. And they're not tied to anatomy.
You may be suggesting that the professional, cultural, political debate of the midwifery is playing out differently on the continent.
Absolutely. It's absolutely different. The situation in France and Italy is in fact quite different from what is happening in England. And in England, I'm going to forget all the dates because I don't have this in my head right now, but there are attempts to, for instance, initiate obstetrics wards, and to make hospitals for obstetrics. They don't necessarily work that well, mostly because they are only supposed to attract the lower classes, because the upper classes continue to only want to give birth at home anyway. Although it becomes fashionable in the second half of the 18th century for the upper classes to have men being their accoucheurs instead of women. But there are these sort of incipient attempts to kind of professionalize and institutionalize obstetrics. And those attempts are very different in the continental situation. So you have instead the traveling midwives that are state supported that go to train midwives all over in France. So it's just sort of really interesting, the kind of difference. But the difference also in the way the books sort of play a role in that institutionalization, because the books just don't have, they're manuals. They truly are manuals, basically, for delivery. They're not tied to anatomy, and they're not about dissection, and they're not about sort of a kind of broader framework for knowledge. But also, the women that I do know in the late part of the 18th century, the early 19th century, they're sculptors for the most part. They're doing weird stuff like mannequins and waxes and paper mache, things. For whatever reason, women seem to sort of be more active in sculpture than they are.
That's what I found sort of fascinating about your account. It's as though these people are actually sculpting the bodies. It's as though they're translating these artistic processes into the anatomy of the so just to sort of emphasize, where is the artist's hand in your account? I think even looking at this kind of you could think about Coalesces and the pointing hand and then again the sharpness. So I'd be curious to hear where do you identify making on a concrete level in terms of the blade or
Right. Well, that's such a difficult issue. I mean, so often there's multiple engravers. Often there is more than one artist who is associated with a given project. Again, somebody like Hunter, who worked with Remsdijk. I mean, Remsdijk, clearly that was what he was doing for about 25 years, because he works with Smelling first. Then he works with Hunter. And Hunter just repudiates Remsdijk at the end. Remsdijk doesn't show up in his sort of final presentation of the volume, although it's also really clear if you go to Glasgow and look at the actual drawings that Rundstedt made, that Rundstedt is he's partly this inventor of the point of view that is taken. And, you know, that they're worth seeing. If you ever in Glasgow, go to the Hunterian collection or go to the special collections and see if you can actually see them. They're very large, you know, because the hunter is an elephant folio. So I said that the original drawings are very, very big, and they're in red chalk, and they're very visceral. I mean, they're startling and visceral.
Would it be possible to find any information about the actual tools for making the print scans and surgical instruments? I mean, I don't know. This is sort of random.
Yeah. Well, and you know, even Hunter actually says that the scratching on the plates is something close to.
Oh, great. Wow.
Yes. I mean, so what Larry had sort of said at the beginning is actually, in a lot of ways, a kind of, you know, subtext sometimes to the attempts to defend engraving as the particular sort of imagistic form that does the most justice to dissection and to anatomy. So there are parallels, and there are a number, also I'll say the number of feminist historians of science who really pushed that, you know, pushed it a lot. You know, the Buren and the dissection, the tools of dissection have this kind of generate from the same sort of
It's
order.
really hard to do that.
Yeah, it's right.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, the alternative is
Sure.
not really reliable. But
That's true.
You know, it's right.
So would you say that the aesthetic decision to manipulate an image either by adding a slide or by adding a memento mori, does that come primarily from the anatomist or from the engraver? You said the anatomist is communicating.
Well, that's, if only we knew. I mean, I will say, this is the murkiest area of these atlases, is understanding what kind of relationship actually exists between the anatomists, and the anatomists are not the only ones doing the preparations either. Like with Hunter, he has a crew of people doing his dissections. So he's not the only one who's even preparing the bodies. So you have multiple hands, right? These are real collaborative efforts. The finished products are collaborative efforts. So you have often multiple engravers, often more than one artist involved, and an anatomist with a crew of helpers, you know, who are basically making decisions. So I think these are collective. They're collective objects. And understanding sort of what happens, like when choices are made or what's added by whom, is largely beyond the archival evidence that's available right now, or in terms of what people have actually turned up. So, but this is a great project. There are some people actually working, particularly on Hunter in England, I mean, in British universities. So, you know, it's become au courant to do it, and so there probably will be a lot more information coming out. But you know, Albinus with Jan van der Leer was an incredible artist, Jan van der Leer, and it's very clear, you know, that Albinus basically directs him and creates a kind of method for him to follow. But whether or not Albinus is the one who said, yeah, throw in a rhinoceros, a famous rhinoceros, right? Right? I mean, that's the kind of stuff that you just don't know, and we don't even really necessarily know why that stuff is in there, right? I mean, other than, you know, in a very general and completely cliched sense, to make them more beautiful. But whatever that means does not necessarily communicate really possibly what they're doing, right? What the place themselves are doing, or what the backgrounds are doing. Oh, sorry.
I was just curious how the argument that these images are for the sake of the practice of dissection fits with the argument that like the injections of wax and things that change the appearance work against the realism or the validity of images.
Oh, you know, that's sort of an interesting question. I mean, the thing is, like, the rhetoric is that these are to sort of aid students in understanding what they see, but that's ridiculous. I mean, like, they can't possibly, probably, really, for the most part, you can't drag Vesalius into the anatomy theater. Seriously, it's a huge book. It weighs like 15 pounds. And it's, the Hunter is elephant folio. That means the plates themselves are about 2 by 1.5 feet. You know, they're huge. They're not really probably intended for that. And Hunter's in particular, it's a subscription, and it's done by a press in Birmingham that was famous for its luxury editions of Aristotle and stuff like that. So this is a luxury item, and it's intended to be a beautiful item to be sort of collected in a library and looked at, in the leisure, at one's leisure. So the idea of these, it's a rhetorical flourish to say that they are supposed to be aids. Now, having said that, I've looked enough at a lot of collections, particularly in the United States, of early printed books, and there are marginalia in a lot of them. And in a lot of them, you also see drawings on pages, the reverse pages that are blank for various engravings that are plates engravings that are inside. So you know that with the smaller volumes, actually, they probably are in fact being used, to a certain degree for comparative purposes, and the text is being read and the images are being looked at in the process of a student actually taking a course on anatomy or doing some kind of anatomical investigation. So there's actually a wonderful one at Northwestern's medical collection, which actually has just the most fantastic pen drawings on the reverses, which are all from another anatomical atlas. And, but hunting down what this actually might mean is really hard, right? Whether or not that's a student who actually had two atlases and decided to draw from one of them, or whether or not that's actually somebody who aided the artist of the second atlas, and sort of was actually creating sort of images on the basis of the ones that he was reading in one atlas to be produced in another one. So little is really known about the sort of active engagement with these books. So,
I mean, what I was asking is, weren't the injections given as part of the process of dissection in order to see where certain features were? And so how does that undermine the truth to anatomy or to the practice in some sense? I see both dimensions, but I'm curious what your view of that is.
Yeah, I mean, there's a very sort of fairly strict protocol in the 18th century that's being followed in terms of dissection. So I'm assuming, you may know this more than I do, but I'm assuming that the injection of the vascular system or something like that really takes place after the dissection of the parts that actually reveals the systems and the organs. So it would be something, in other words, hopefully, right, you would see first what the body looked like without the injections before you actually then saw it explained further with the use of wax injections or colors. So that because you would need both, right? How as a student could you possibly learn where to inject if you haven't actually learned to recognize what it is that you need to inject, right? So it has to be a kind of process of layering up and learning. So in that sense, well, you think of how fast the body's decayed, right? So they have to work very fast. So, and also you would want to do those injections fairly fast because vessels collapse and veins collapse and things like that. So you need to get in there while the body is still fresh in order to do that. But I'm assuming that there was a kind of progression to it. But I can't really answer it. And I'm not sure what it does to, I mean, that's when Vindu shows both of those, right? He shows you both so that you can understand even what the difference would be between seeing a heart as it's pulled out of the cadaver and seeing it when it's been pumped full of explanatory material.
About the issue of texture, I'm looking at the strong thing about the ways that the students and the tongue and how to distinguish from that. But I'm wondering if the introduction of tactility as a way of knowing might have a formal effect in terms of more emphasis on textures and how to capture the image.
Oh, that's a great point. Yeah, and I think if you the kind of intricacy of the plates for Hunter show this incredible, and Hunter himself actually even weighs in at some point. It says there's special techniques that need to be used in order to not disguise that's this really sort of interesting sort of issue about, well, you know, how much can the line actually stand in for what it is that you see, and how, and when does shading start to obliterate the line that it's necessary to see in engraving. So I think that, I don't have a good answer to that, but I think that that's a very interesting issue in terms of particularly that medium, which is sort of what, and that goes back to the Gautier, Gautier, because mesotin is just, it's useless for actually seeing anything. It looks great, but it's just useless, right? But I think there is a very, very strong current in there about sort of judging what is actually appropriate in terms of achieving the kind of beauty of the image in order to make it seem, you know, lifelike and real, versus being able to show in a schematic way what it is that actually, the different sort of parts of the body that need to be represented for you to be able to recognize them as such. And so there's a